Hey everybody, how we doing today? My name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd, I'm sure most of you know. Today I'm going to show you a rearranging I did of my records. It was still done by label, but we had to add my 10 inches into the mix. This, as most of you remember, was my 10-inch case. But with the coffee shop coming online here in the next few months, I didn't want my 10 inches being exposed to people walking off with them. We figured it'd be a better use of space to put merchandise in this cabinet or something. So I figured before the mess really got started, I would incorporate my 10 inches into the rest of my collection. And it allows us to see the full bodies of work of some of these labels that bridge that gap between 10 inch and 12 inch. And I think it's kind of exciting actually seeing some of these labels, full bodies of work. Some labels have far better representation of their 10 inch stuff than others, but still there's a lot of 10 inches that are going to be fun to see mixed in with regular body of work of the label post 54, 55 when they went to the 12 inch. First we're going to start with the big New York labels. And on this top shelf up here, what we have is Savoy. And Savoy runs all the way across here, and then we get to Regent, which was a label that Herman Levinsky bought up in the 40s. They kind of stayed co-independent, and then eventually they were kind of wrapped into the Savoy family and formula. And there's some pretty solid jazz titles there in the 6000 series. Once you get into the 6040s and 6060s in there, some great stuff happens at Regent. And then this is my 10 inches at Savoy, which I have a nice little stack of. Of course, the body of work of Savoy on 10 inch is much greater than that. However, I have a lot of it been reshoot on the 12 inch LP, so I don't have a ton of Savoy 10 inches. The next thing we're going to look at here is Riverside, one of the great New York labels. And this is some earlier stuff here. And then this is the 200 sequence, the 300 sequence, the 400 sequence is here. And then we get into, there's the Riverside 10 inch stuff right there. And then there's Jazzland, which was, of course, affiliated with Riverside. They were started off as a budget label. They ended up having a lot of interesting titles issued on their own. Coming back to this first cabinet here, what we have here is Roulette, and this is Roost. This is the Dawn label out of New York, and then this is the Storyville label out of Boston. And when you look at Roost, if you can zoom in here, you'll see that body of Roost work, LP-wise, is really fleshed out much thicker when you add in all that Roost 10-inch stuff, which Roost had a lot of 10-inch stuff from the 53, 54, 55, stuff like Johnny Smith and Stan Getz, and of course Sonny Stitt. Dawn's a great little label that people kind of overlook. And if you look at Storyville again, the body of work at Storyville, there's more 10-inch stuff than there is 12-inch LP stuff, even though Storyville gets reintroduced as a label in Denmark. I think in the 70s it kind of comes back. And that happens with a lot of these labels. Trend that happens with, Progressive that happens with, Storyville happens with. These labels get kind of rebirthed decades later, even though they're not the same management or ownership. The label had enough cachet, or they purchased the name, and these labels resurface, but there's often big gaps between their initial runs and ownership and management. Henry needs to say hi, and then that resurfacing decades later is usually a whole new group of managers, and sometimes they try to find similar music, but they're often very different eras and different sounds for the most part. Down here, this is the Jubilee label, formed by Herb Abramson. Abramson was an early partner at Atlantic. He left and went on his own way. I got some Jubilee 10 inches. Jubilee shares an art department with Roost and Bethlehem in terms of Burt Goldblatt being one of their leading designers, especially in the 53 to 55 era. Burt Goldblatt's fingerprints are everywhere in jazz. And then we move on to Everest, which is a label that starts in New York and was meant to be very sonically high quality stereo is what they were kind of going for. with early mono stuff as well. And Everest has some great titles from guys like Charlie Barnett and Woody Herman, John LaPorta. It's actually a fairly big mix at Everest that people kind of don't realize how much good stuff they had. And then we're going to move on to Atlantic here. And Atlantic, I have a few 10 inches of, not a ton. That's a great Burt Goldblatt cover. But Atlantic starts here with 1200 sequence. And then moves here into the 1300 sequence, 1400 sequence, and the 1500 sequence. And so you get kind of a chronology. You get kind of a chronology here with these labels when you see them filed by their release code numbers. Everything kind of goes from that middle 50s era towards the 60s, maybe even towards the 70s, which we get towards the end of this cabinet. Up here now, come closer. Up here now we have the Bethlehem label. And there you see the Bethlehem body of 10 inches. And Bethlehem has like 37, a lot of 10-inch material. But then Bethlehem has the entire BCP series, and then the 6000 series. And then King takes over kind of in this area here. So a lot of this stuff isn't actual Bethlehem stuff, but it was released under the Bethlehem logo and name. So that's the body of work of Bethlehem. So to see it all from 53 through to like 1960, 61, it's quite an impressive body of work. Again, that's Riverside here. What we have here now is, this is the Jazz and the Philharmonic stuff. And I did an episode on these recently. And you can see here, there's the Philharmonic 10 inches, the box sets. And then we get into Norgran, a real solid early label for Norman Granz, Buddy DeFranco, Dizzy Gillespie and Stan Getz. You know, more Dizzy Gillespie, Stan Getz, the 6. More Norgran stuff. And then this is Clef stuff. Some great titles in there. And then this is early Clef stuff as well. 600 sequence. And that early Clef stuff and Norgran stuff all gets, well, not all, but a lot of it gets repackaged under the Verve name, which, when we look at this cabinet here, Norman Granz starts here with the Clef, Philharmonic, Norgran stuff, and it becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 doors of Verve. That's all Norman Granz, 6 doors. And it's the biggest collection right there with Prestige, which starts here with Swingsville, Moodsville, New Jazz, and then we start the Prestige 7000 series across that way. And so you can see the difference here with a Bethlehem body of work, which is 2 doors, versus Atlantic, which is 3 doors, versus a Roost, which is half a door, Prestige family, which is 5 doors. These labels, some of them are just so prolific and made so much great music. Moving into the next door here, we got Blue Note. The Blue Note 10-inch errors up here. 1500 sequence, 4000, 4100, 4200, 4300, and then there's all the Tone Poet stuff that's coming out recently. A nice little chunk of that stuff. And so even here with the Prestige and the Verve and then Impulse down here, you'll see how the stuff goes from the 50s into the 60s and towards the 70s. So we have here is the Prestige 7000, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 7600 plus. Over 600 Prestige titles when you include Moodsville and Swingsville. There's around 600 Verve records here. On this next shelf down, we have ABC records, which made some really great titles, including like Kenny Dorham, some Oscar Pettiford stuff. And it's ABC that decides to launch Impulse in late 1960. And Impulse runs from 1960 all the way here towards the 70s. Bottom shelf down here I have CTI, which is pretty much all the CTI, some Kudu stuff, Down here I have 70s jazz, fusion, kind of R&B crossover stuff, a wide range of 70s stuff. And then this shelf here features some European labels like ECM, Steeplechase, Black and Blue, Black Lion, Felstead, Phillips, Fontana. And then we have some 70s and 80s labels like Pablo, Milestone, Perception, Muse, Concord, Sue, Flying Dutchman, Contact. And that kind of completes this side of the cabinet. Pause it. So now we're looking at the West Coast cabinet. And these top three shelves in particular are all LA based, and actually the fourth shelf is too. This is the Fantasy label, which is actually from the Bay Area. And of course the Fantasy 10 inches got added there. Here's the Pacific 10 inches. And then this is Pacific Records all the way across. So a door and a half of Pacific. Contemporary is a full door. This is the United Artists series. And they of course have the 5000 sequence. And then they have the 14,000 sequence. And I just completed that sequence recently. I have every title on that. This is the King label now, out of Cincinnati originally, but they relocated to Chicago at one point. And it fits best there, even though it kind of should be in that door. This would be Capitol Records. And there's some Capitol 10 inches down here. Quite a nice little chunk of them. Including that great series of Stan Kenton Presents. This is Liberty. And Liberty has some nice West Coast jazz, along with like the Julie London stuff. And then Reprise Records, which was, of course, Frank Sinatra's label. But there's some great stuff on that label, including stuff like Count Basie and Ellington and a wide range of stuff like Jack Sheldon has a record. And then here's Warner Brothers, kind of the last of the studios record labels to kind of really do jazz stuff. And they are everything from The Crossing to Chico Hamilton. You got some Herbie Hancock. Warner Brothers definitely kind of comes late to the game in jazz. On the bottom down here we have RCA. And RCA is, of course, one of the major labels, and they're more New York-based. But I have all my major labels on the bottom here with Capitol, RCA, Vic, which is a RCA subsidiary down here. This will be Decca 10 inches, and then the 9200 sequence Decca, and then Corral, which was also a Decca affiliate. But up top here, these are all small West Coast labels. This is some miscellaneous stuff that only have a title or two by. Andex, a great little label. Ava Coria, some great titles. Crown, which is part of the Modern family. Dutone, Du2 has 5 great jazz records. The G&P, G. Norman Presents stuff. Hi-Fi Records, which has some great titles as well as some kind of more easy listening stuff. Imperial is a great label. Imperial is the one that ended up buying out Aladdin, which is missing here. There it is. Aladdin also had score and intro under their umbrella, and then these three all got bought out by Imperial, and so Imperial actually reissues a lot of the stuff that was on Aladdin and score and intro. It's all kind of confusing, and it takes a lot of kind of time to grasp it all. Jazz West is actually another label that was part of the Aladdin sequence. I just didn't want to mix it in because there's enough titles that are kind of unique to Jazz West. This is the Metro Jazz MGM section. MGM was, again, one of the big film studios that created a label for their soundtracks. They ended up doing a little sequence called Metro Jazz. It's only 15 titles, but it's really, really great. East. It's actually a mix of East and West Coast stuff, that stuff. Then we have Mode, a great little West Coast label with around 30 titles. I'm missing about 5 of those at this point. It's kind of something I'm slowly working on. Next is the Nocturne label, which we talked about recently. A small little label that made about 8 releases before they folded. It was Roy Hart for Pacific Records and Harry Babison, the bass player. Full form Nocturne. Then it's Specialty Records, which has 2 or 3 really solid jazz records, including stuff by Gerald Wiggins and Buddy Collette. And of course, that's probably the most famous Specialty record with Lee Morgan and Charlie Persip and Billy Mitchell and Al Gray. That's great stuff. And then next we have the Tampa label. And Tampa's another one of those great little West Coast labels. They bought out Skylark. They bought out Dig. They bought out the Motif label. And they kind of repackaged it and released it as Tampa stuff. And I think they did some of their own recordings as well. But It's a very convoluted West Coast scene. This is the Trend label, another little LA label with a lot of 10 inches and only a few LPs before they folded their tents, only to resurface again decades later. Now in this cabinet, we're kind of dealing with the Midwest and Chicago, even though this bottom shelf here is Columbia, 3 doors of it. And this is Epic, which is part of Columbia. Down here is some miscellaneous pre-war stuff from the Smithsonian label, the Olympic label, MCA Heritage. Mostly stuff, like I said, from pre-war 78 era. This next shelf here running across is Emersy. Here's the Emersy 10 inches. Emersy runs pretty much all the way to here. Then it's Mercury, which is the master parent label of Emersy. Emersy folds, and they just start putting the jazz out on Mercury. And one of the great labels that's kind of under the radar just on collectors today. Here's the Argo family. And Argo's, of course, related to Chess, Cadet, as we talked the other day. Here's the 4000 sequence. I don't have all of those, but I do have all the Argo 600s and most of the Argo 700s. And it turns the Cadet right around here, and then it starts to thin out some. A lot of great soul jazz comes in the 60s from Argo Cadet. Now what we have up top here is the East Coast micro labels. There's a lot of little small labels up here, some miscellaneous East Coast stuff. Here's Allegro Records, which has some interesting stuff. Audio Fidelity has some really good titles that are kind of under the radar, from Lyle Hampton and Louis Armstrong to Pat Moran to gals like Beverly Kelly. The next label we're going to feature here is Brunswick, a small label from New Jersey that kind of ventured into jazz briefly in the 50s and then went to more R&B with stuff like the Shy Lights. But I'm a big fan of some of that Brunswick stuff. Count Basie's on there. This great Tony Scott record. Well, I think Bill Evans might be on that, if I remember. Candid, which is a label associated with more of the avant-garde and kind of the edges of the music. Some great Mingus and Abbey Lincoln. This is Charlie Parker Records, a label that was formed by Parker's family to help fight all the counterfeit and bootleggers out there putting out Parker recordings. They try to give them the official releases on that label. This is Colpix, a label I think was out of Tennessee originally, but ends up in New York. And they have some great titles as well, from Jimmy Russian to, I forget who that is. That's Zoot Sims and Alcona, I think. Nina Simone, more Nina. There's quite a bit of Nina on this label. Then we go to Commodore Records, which is one of the great 40s labels that's kind of forgotten because they didn't get a lot of stuff released on LP, and some of it gets released by like Atlantic Records, like this Billie Holiday record. Mainstream reissues, some Commodore stuff on this sequence. There's a big box set of Commodore stuff I'd like to get at some point. Next is a label called Cook that does some small stuff. Torchy Lullabies, Lizzie Miles, Laverne Smith, who has a great record on Savoy. That's a pretty hard record to come by. Cook's a good little label, and Cook was really dedicated to sonic clarity, and I guess they were a label for audiophiles even in the 50s. Was kind of what part of their deal was. Then it's Debut Records, who was a label founded by Mingus that he ends up giving to his ex-wife, I think, at Fantasy. So they kind of become a fantasy label. But Debut has a lot of great titles. Delmark, one of the great Chicago labels, has a number of really great titles. Bob Coaster had the record store in Chicago Jazz Record Mart. Bouncing with Bud Powell, All the Gin Is Gone, Jimmy Forrest, John Young Trio, the great Chicago piano player, Ira Sullivan. So Delmark has some great, sorry, not Delmark, yeah, Delmark has some great titles, and are kind of underappreciated today. Here's the Dial record label, which was a label that was around in the 40s that switched to jazz and bebop in 46, 47, recorded a lot of great Charlie Parker stuff and a few other people, and then they went away from jazz, but their legacy is really entrenched in those bebop recordings. Dot label has some great stuff. Elektra Records, but this is way before the rock and roll Jim Morrison days. Elektra has some great titles. Teddy Charles, Four French Horns, the New York Jazz Quartet with Matt Matthews and Joe Puma and Whitey Mitchell and Herbie Mann. Elektra has some really cool stuff with cool covers. This is the Jarro label. It's got a great Kenny Dorham record, some Cootie Williams, some J.R. Montrose. Next will be the Jazz Time Jazz Line label, which has about 5 or 6 releases, including a lot of Dave Bailey stuff, a Duke Pearson record, Rocky Boyd. Then it's Jazz Tone, which is a label that actually was doing mail order stuff, and you could subscribe to them and they would send you stuff. A lot of it was repackaged, recording some other labels that they would license somehow and put out there. But you can often find great early recordings on Jazz Tone for much less than the original recordings would go for. Cat label, which is another new label I've introduced here, has some great stuff by Dave Pell, Ruth Price, the great singer, Dave Pell. Those titles actually were originally on the Trend label and got reissued here on Cap out of New York. One of the great Cap labels is Louis Armstrong, of course, Hello Dolly, which was a big hit, and then this Bossa Nova record has a lot of great guitar players on it. One of the first Cap records I really collected. Next is Keynote, and Keynote's like Commodore, a great 40s label. A lot of really important recordings by great artists that didn't make it into the 50s. My wife bought me the Keynote box set. It's 21 LPs. It's coming in the mail. It'll be here soon to fill this slot in. The two things in there right now are both stuff from Keynote that Mercury reissued, probably in the 70s. Again, a lot of great artists on Keynote. It's a label that gets definitely kind of overlooked by today's collectors. Next, I got Period. Period Records is a label formed by Leonard Feather, the British jazz pianist, writer, and critic. He convinced Period, which was a classical music label, to do some jazz recordings. A lot of it came out on 10-inch LP. Has been reissued numerous times, from Sonny Rollins to Al Haig, Django Reinhardt, Maxine Sullivan, some great stuff on Period. Next is Progressive. And Progressive is one of those labels that start off in the 10-inch era. There's a couple of Al Cohn records, which I'm looking for. Then they switch over to the LP era with a Wallington and this record here with a Hal Stein. And then they fold up their camp, only to resurface decades later with a whole new series of records in the 70s. So it's one of those labels that kind of comes back. Time Records, Bob Shad out of New York. Some great stuff, including some great Kenny Dorham records, some Max Roach stuff. Transition out of Boston, a great little label with some great Donald Byrd stuff. The great bass player Doug Watkins has a famous record here on Transition. Next would be Urania, which is a New York label that has some great titles that really kind of get overlooked a lot. Stuff like this Mood and Blue with Coleman Hawkins, this Jimmy Hamilton record, this Lucky Thompson album. Some great stuff, more Jimmy Hamilton. People kind of don't really recognize Urania very much. Next is Vanguard, and Vanguard also has a nice little cachet of 10-inch LPs into the 12-inch LPs. Stuff like Ronnie Ball and Dave Burns, Billy English. And then last is VJ, which is out of the Chicagoland area. And VJ has a lot of great titles. I'm going to do an episode on them soon coming up called the VJ Reissue Series. And so I've now separated out 100 labels. It happens to be right on the nose. I didn't plan it that way. I knew I was going to be close to 100, but now I have 100 labels separated out. And there's also some miscellaneous sections strewn about for stuff that doesn't have a lot of releases. But it's a really cool way to see all the records. With the 10 inches now part of their body of work, it really gives you a better perspective of how much work each label did. When you have those doors that are like 7 doors of Verve and 6 doors of Prestige versus these doors up here where you get 20 labels, each with a half dozen to a dozen titles. It's quite a convoluted world, the Jazz Kingdom, and it's really fun to be able to share it with you like this. And it's educational just to see it laid out like this. I love seeing my Roos records together. I love seeing my Bethlehem records together, the Blue Note 10 inches. And remember, a lot of these labels did reissue a lot of the 10-inch stuff, but a lot of the 10-inch stuff never got repackaged or resurfaced ever again. So the 10-inch era has a lot to offer, and it's fun seeing it put together with the 12-inch stuff. I did like my 10-inch cabinet, but this way they're under lock and key, safe and protected. And I hope you enjoyed that tour through my record collection, my jazz collection anyway. Stay tuned to the channel. I got some great stuff coming. If you want to subscribe, it's always appreciated. Hit that like button, ring that bell for alerts. And if you want to support the channel, go to Patreon and pledge a few dollars a month. It's always appreciated to help me support my family and help me make great content for this channel. Y'all be great. Have a great day. And like the music you like. Don't let anybody else convince you what you need to like or what's important to hear. Like and listen to the jazz that makes sense to you. That's the way you'll enjoy the experience the most. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Peace.